The Scottish Government, as you rightly point out, is a devolved administration. It doesn't have foreign affairs as part of its responsibilities. It's got business. They keep telling us about climate change and emissions and why we shouldn't be totting them up. But here's an example of them doing that themselves. And then, for ordinary people, I think there's a cost of living crisis. Can they not just stick to their day job?
Take us through what you've worked out, what you've totted up, the amount of miles that SNP ministers have done in the last, 18 months?
Well, you'll remember 18 months ago, you couldn't fly. We couldn't fly because of COVID. And I thought I'd take a look, given the First Minister was off to Dubai this week to COP28, and found out that his net zero minister was off too, a couple of SPADs, some officials, the SNP leader of Glasgow City Council, and 3 officials, just as the External Affairs Minister for the SNP came back from a 6-day trip in China. And then I discovered that the Rural Affairs Cabinet Secretary was in France for a few days. So I thought I'd take a look over the past 18 months, and I found that 25 ministers had been in 29 countries across 4 continents in 86 different trips. Now, nobody's arguing they shouldn't go on all of these trips, but it looks a bit excessive, and that's what opposition parties would say. The Scottish Government, as you rightly point out, is a devolved administration. It doesn't have foreign affairs as part of its responsibilities. It's got business. They keep telling us about climate change and emissions and why we shouldn't be totting them up. But here's an example of them doing that themselves. And then, for ordinary people, I think there's a cost of living crisis. Can they not just stick to their day job?
So what's the justification from the SNP for all of these trips?
The Scottish Government would say one of the reasons, for example, Scotland's got the highest levels of foreign investment outside London is on trade matters. Ministers can help seal deals. They say that travel's an essential part of their business. Look, to be fair, for some in the SNP, it's all about Scotland playing on the world stage. That having been said, I think the criticism still remains. I also took a look, I should say, from 2016 to 2019 at what the Scottish Government was doing, and I found an astonishing 267 trips had been taken to everywhere round about the world.
And how does this marry up with Scotland's stated aim to be a net zero nation by 2045?
Well, that's for the government to justify at the end of the day. I think it's fair to say the SNP Green government in Scotland make this a big, big priority. There have been numerous reports over the past year, certainly saying that they are not meeting their climate targets. Sometimes they blame Westminster for that. But to be fair on this issue, I think they've still got some questions to answer.
So take us through who are the ministers who've travelled the most and where they've been?
The External Affairs and Culture Minister, Angus Robertson, who used to be the SNP's Westminster leader, has been on 16 trips in the last 18 months, nearly one a month. I calculated that he's travelled nearly twice round the circumference of the globe on those trips. Other ministers, Trade Minister Ivan McKee, I think he's second on the list. Humza Yousaf himself, he in the past few months has been to, where has he been? He's in Dubai at the moment. He was on a trip to the United States quite recently. I think in total he's only been though on 4 trips this year. But there's 25 ministers altogether. Now the Scottish Government has 27 ministers. Some of them have left. But you're really talking about most of the ministers having been abroad in the last 18 months. One of the law officers, in fact, was in Mauritius. That sounds good, but I'm sure it was very legitimate business.